It started with a familiar pattern, another round of tough talk on trade, another attempt to reduce reliance on Canadian resources. But this time, the spotlight fell on something many Canadians hadn't thought about much in their daily lives: potash. That humble mineral, dug from the Saskatchewan prairie, that quietly keeps crops growing across North America. Within weeks, the conversation shifted. What began as a push to replace Canadian supply ended with a noticeable step back. And in that shift lies a revealing story about interdependence, leverage, and the realities of modern agriculture between Canada and the United States. Welcome back to Canada Pulse. Thank you for joining us. Stories like this one matter because they cut through the noise of headlines and show how decisions made in Washington and Ottawa ripple straight into Canadian communities, American farms, and ultimately the food on tables across both countries. We dig into the details here with context and balance, so you understand not just what happened, but why it matters to your household, your province, and the broader economy. If reliable Canadian-focused analysis is important to you, I hope you'll stay with us. Let's begin with the numbers that surprised many observers. According to industry data and U.S. Geological Survey figures referenced widely in recent months, the United States has relied on Canada for roughly 85 to 90% of its potash imports in recent years. Some measurements put the effective dependence even higher when looking at total consumption. Potash, for those less familiar, is a critical fertilizer component rich in potassium. It strengthens plants, improves yields, and helps maintain healthy soil. Without reliable supplies, large-scale modern farming as we know it becomes far more difficult and expensive. Saskatchewan produces the vast majority of Canadian potash. The province sits on some of the world's largest and most accessible reserves. Mines operated by companies like Nutrien and Mosaic have built a sophisticated, efficient supply chain that moves millions of tons southward every year, mostly tariff-free under the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement. This relationship developed over decades. It wasn't an accident of policy, but a reflection of geology, economics, and practical necessity. When the latest round of trade tensions escalated earlier this year, President Trump's administration signaled strong interest in reducing that dependence. There were public comments about accelerating domestic U.S. production, exploring alternative suppliers, and using tariffs as leverage. For a moment, it looked like potash could become another flashpoint, similar to steel, aluminum, or softwood lumber in previous disputes. American farmers and agribusiness groups watched closely. So did Canadian producers and the Saskatchewan government. Then, something interesting happened. Within a relatively short period, die Madencher Enser, Dinsker, and Nieninker, and Setter, Ifer, and Seker, Enser, Iner reports varied, but many pointed to roughly 5 weeks of intense discussion. The Komodinar, and Seker, Ensa, and Seker, then Seka, the tone softened. Full implementation of broad tariffs on potash faced significant pushback. U.S. farm organizations warned of higher input costs at a time when many operators were already managing tight margins. Replacing Canadian supply quickly proved more complicated than it first appeared. Domestic U.S. production exists, but operates at a much smaller scale. Other international sources, such as those in Russia or Belarus, carry their own geopolitical and logistical complications. Prime Minister Mark Carney and his government navigated this carefully. Carney, with his background in finance and central banking, approached the issue with a steady hand. Public statements emphasized the mutual benefits of stable trade while quietly reinforcing Canada's position as a reliable supplier. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe and industry leaders highlighted the integrated nature of North American agriculture. The message was consistent. This isn't about confrontation for its own sake, but about recognizing practical realities that affect farmers on both sides of the border. To truly understand this episode, we need to go deeper into the geology and economics. Potash in Saskatchewan comes from ancient seabeds formed hundreds of millions of years ago. The deposits are vast, high quality, and relatively inexpensive to extract compared to many alternatives. Canadian producers have invested heavily in capacity, logistics, and environmental management over the years. This creates a structural advantage that isn't easily duplicated overnight. On the American side, farmers in the Midwest Corn Belt, the Great Plains, and other major agricultural regions depend on consistent, affordable fertilizer. Potash is one of the 3 primary macronutrients, alongside nitrogen and phosphorus. Any sudden disruption in supply or sharp price increase flows directly into higher costs for planting, which can eventually influence food prices at the grocery store. That connection explains why farm state senators and representatives from both parties expressed reservations about aggressive tariff action on this particular commodity. I remember speaking with people in the industry during similar tensions in the past. One veteran agronomist in Saskatchewan put it simply, you can't just flip a switch and create new mines. These are billion-dollar projects that take years to develop. So in Isis and Nasambor and Nor, that reality seemed to sink in during the recent episode. Proposals for new U.S. mines or expanded production received attention, but timelines stretched far beyond immediate needs. In the meantime, American agriculture needed potash in the quantities and at the consistency Canada has provided. This isn't the first time potash has surfaced in trade discussions. During previous administrations and earlier Trump terms, exemptions or special treatment for fertilizers appeared from time to time. The sector has generally enjoyed relatively stable access under USMCA rules. What made this round different was the broader context of renewed tariff threats across multiple sectors and the very public emphasis on reducing perceived dependencies. For Canadian communities, especially in Saskatchewan, potash represents far more than just another export. It supports thousands of direct and indirect jobs. It contributes significantly to provincial revenues through royalties and taxes. Towns like Esterhazy, Rocanville, and Vanscoy have grown around the mines. Families plan their lives around the stability of the industry. When international demand wavers or trade tensions rise, those communities feel it. Yet Canada's position also carries responsibilities. As a major global supplier, Canadian producers must maintain environmental standards, invest in innovation, and ensure long-term sustainability. The industry has faced criticism in the past over water usage, tailings management, and greenhouse gas emissions. Recent years have seen efforts to improve performance, including investments in more efficient extraction and lower carbon technologies. Mark Carney's government has tried to position Canada as a stable, responsible partner in critical minerals and resources. Potash fits into that narrative, even if it's less flashy than lithium or rare earths. By emphasizing reliability, Ottawa hopes to weather periods of political volatility south of the border. Let's take a moment to consider the human dimension. Picture a farmer in Iowa or Illinois reviewing input costs for the coming season. A significant jump in potash prices could mean tighter margins or difficult choices about how much fertilizer to apply, which in turn affects yields. Now, picture a miner in Saskatchewan heading underground or operating heavy equipment, knowing that steady exports support his family's mortgage and the local hockey arena. These are the real stakes behind the policy statements and press conferences. Economists tracking the file note that sudden tariffs on potash would likely function more as a tax on American agriculture than an effective tool to reshape supply chains quickly. Much of the cost would pass through to U.S. buyers. That dynamic helps explain the relatively rapid adjustment in approach. Reports emerged of quiet consultations between industry groups, lawmakers, and administration officials. The result was a de-escalation that prevented major disruption, at least for now. Of course, not everyone sees it the same way. Some voices in the United States argue that long-term strategic independence in critical inputs makes sense regardless of short-term costs. They point to national security concerns and the desire to bolster domestic industry. In Canada, others worry about over-reliance on a single market and advocate for greater diversification of potash exports toward Asia, Latin America, and Europe. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. Complete self-sufficiency in complex supply chains is rare in the modern world, but reducing vulnerabilities where possible remains a legitimate policy goal. The episode also highlights the unique nature of the Canada-U.S. relationship. We are each other's largest trading partners. Our economies are deeply integrated. Supply chains cross the border seamlessly in normal times. When politics introduces friction, the effects can be swift and sometimes unexpected. Potash turned out to be one of those areas where interdependence proved more resilient than political rhetoric. As the dust settles, several questions linger. Will there be renewed investment in U.S. potash capacity? How might Canada respond if future rounds of tariffs target this sector more directly? What role should governments play in supporting critical mineral supply chain resilience without disrupting markets? These are complex issues without simple answers. For Saskatchewan, the near-term outlook remains relatively positive as long as access to the U.S. market continues. Companies like Nutrien have significant global reach and can adjust shipments if needed. But no one in the industry takes stability for granted. Long-term contracts, infrastructure investments, and diplomatic efforts all play a part in maintaining these flows. Canadian consumers might not think about potash when they buy bread, meat, or vegetables, but the connection exists. Stable fertilizer prices help moderate food costs. Disruptions can contribute to inflationary pressures in the grocery aisle. That's why these seemingly technical trade matters deserve broader attention. Mark Carney has spoken in the past about the importance of Canada leveraging its resource strengths responsibly in a changing global economy. This recent chapter with Potash offers a case study. It shows both the strengths and the limitations of Canada's position. We have resources the world needs, but we operate in a continental marketplace where our largest customer can, at times, flex significant muscle. Looking ahead, analysts suggest the most likely path is continued pragmatic management of the relationship. Full decoupling appears impractical in the near term. Instead, both countries may focus on incremental steps, modest increases in domestic production, where feasible, joint investments in sustainable mining technologies, and ongoing dialogue to prevent sudden disruptions. There's a broader lesson here too. In an era of renewed great power competition and supply chain worries, middle powers like Canada possess quiet advantages in specific commodities. Potash is one, uranium is another. Critical minerals more broadly could become strategic assets if managed thoughtfully. The challenge lies in converting those geological advantages into lasting economic and diplomatic benefits without falling into complacency. As this story continues to unfold, we'll keep following the developments. Any new statements from Washington, responses from Canadian producers, impacts on provincial budgets in Saskatchewan, and ultimately what it means for farmers and consumers. Trade relationships this important rarely resolve in single dramatic moments. They evolve through layers of negotiation, economic pressure, industry advocacy, and political calculation. One thing feels clear after this episode. The 87% dependence figure, whether exactly accurate or slightly rounded, captured attention. It reminded policymakers on both sides that agriculture supply chains are deeply linked. Food security doesn't stop at the border. It depends on practical cooperation even when political winds blow in other directions. We at Canada Pulse will continue tracking how this balance plays out. Whether you're a farmer in the prairies, a worker in the mines, an investor watching commodity markets, or simply a Canadian concerned about our economic sovereignty, these issues touch all of us in subtle but meaningful ways. I'd be interested to hear your perspective in the comments. How do you view Canada's role as a resource supplier to the United States? Should we be doing more to diversify markets, or is the current integration the best path? What role should the federal government play when specific industries face trade pressure? Thank you for spending this time with us. Stories like this one remind us why careful, fact-based analysis matters in a noisy information environment. If you value this kind of deep dive into Canadian policy and economic realities, consider subscribing and joining our growing community. We'll be here with the next update as events develop. Take care, and we'll see you soon.